For nearly 300 years, one empire made the ancient world tremble. Its kings didn't just conquer cities. They skinned their rulers alive and displayed the bodies as a warning to the next city on the list. This was Assyria, the first true military superpower in human history. An empire so feared that entire nations surrendered without a single arrow being fired. But here's the twist. In less than 15 years, this empire, the most powerful the world had ever seen, vanished. Not weakened, not shrunk, erased. Today, we're tracing how Assyria built an empire on pure terror, and why that same terror is exactly what destroyed it. Assyria began as a modest trading city called Ashur, tucked on the banks of the Tigris River in what's now northern Iraq. For centuries, it was just one power among many in Mesopotamia, overshadowed by Babylon to the south, and by the older, wealthier kingdoms further afield. Nothing about it suggested it would one day rule from the banks of the Nile to the mountains of Iran. That changed around the 10th century BCE, when Assyria stopped playing defense and began an unbroken run of conquest that would not slow down for 300 years. What made Assyria different wasn't just ambition, it was organization. While its neighbors fielded seasonal armies made up of farmers who went home for the harvest, Assyria built something the ancient world had never truly seen before: a professional standing army. Soldiers who trained year-round, whose entire purpose was war. Iron weapons that shattered the bronze swords of their enemies. Siege engines and battering rams engineered specifically to break down city walls that had stood for generations. They also built the infrastructure of conquest itself. Roads designed for rapid troop movement. Relay messenger systems that could carry orders across the empire in days rather than weeks. Standardized logistics that kept massive armies fed and supplied hundreds of miles from home. In many ways, this was the first true military-industrial machine in human history, a state organized, from top to bottom, around the business of war. And then there's the part that defines Assyria in popular memory, the part that still shocks people today. It wasn't an accident, it was policy. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II documented their own atrocities in stone, carving them directly into palace walls for anyone to see. Mass impalements, prisoners flayed alive, pyramids of severed heads stacked outside the gates of conquered cities. These weren't hidden away in shame. They were broadcast deliberately across the empire, carried by merchants and messengers and refugees from city to city. The logic behind it was cold, but brutally effective. A city that had heard exactly what happened to the last city that resisted was far more likely to simply open its gates. Assyria weaponized its own reputation. Fear became a substitute for armies they didn't even need to send. Why fight a war you could win just by making sure everyone already knew how it would end? The other tool in Assyria's arsenal was mass deportation. Conquered populations, sometimes tens of thousands of people at a time, were forcibly uprooted from their homelands and resettled elsewhere across the empire. It was a calculated strategy to break local identity and dismantle resistance networks before they could ever take root. Scatter people far enough from their homeland, and rebellion becomes almost impossible to organize. It worked for a while, but it also meant that with every single conquest, Assyria was manufacturing new enemies and never quite finishing the job of turning them into loyal subjects. By the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE, Assyria wasn't just a regional power anymore. It was an empire in the truest sense. Conquered territory was no longer left in the hands of local puppet kings who might rebel the moment Assyrian attention turned elsewhere. Instead, it was reorganized directly into imperial provinces, governed by Assyrian officials answering straight to the crown. It was an administrative innovation that let the empire actually hold on to what its armies conquered, instead of endlessly reconquering the same territory year after year. Then, under King Esarhaddon, Assyria did something that would have seemed unthinkable a century earlier. It conquered Egypt, the oldest, most prestigious civilization in the ancient world. A civilization that had already stood for thousands of years fell under Assyrian control. For a brief, remarkable moment, Assyrian power stretched from the banks of the Nile all the way to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen. The empire reached its cultural high point under Ashurbanipal, one of history's strangest kings, a man capable of horrifying brutality on the battlefield, and yet also responsible for one of the greatest achievements in the ancient world. At Nineveh, his capital, Ashurbanipal built what we now call the Library of Nineveh, one of the first truly systematic archives in human history. Tens of thousands of clay tablets were gathered from every corner of the empire, preserving medicine, astronomy, law, religious texts, and literature. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever written, a story that survives today, largely because Ashurbanipal's scribes thought it was worth saving. It's a strange contradiction worth sitting with for a moment. The same king who ordered campaigns of terror against his enemies was also racing to preserve the accumulated knowledge of his entire world, as if some part of him understood exactly how fragile all of it really was. He was right to worry. Here's the problem with ruling an empire through fear. It works perfectly, right up until the moment you show weakness. And when that moment finally comes, everyone you have terrorized for 3 centuries remembers exactly what you did to them. Assyria had no shortage of enemies waiting for their chance. The Babylonians to the south had been conquered and reconquered again and again, and had never once stopped resisting in some form. The Medes, a rising power out of the Iranian plateau, had their own long list of grievances to settle. Assyria's entire method of rule, deportation, destruction, public humiliation, meant it never truly converted the people it conquered into loyal subjects. It only ever produced subjects who were waiting patiently for their moment. When Ashurbanipal died around 631 BCE, the empire he left behind had no successor capable of matching him. Succession disputes tore at the center of Assyrian power at the exact moment its overextended borders needed the strongest possible leadership. The machine that had run without pause for 300 years suddenly had no one firmly at the controls. Sensing the opening, Babylon's king, Nabopolassar, rose in open revolt. And crucially, he didn't fight alone. He allied with the Medes under their king, Cyaxares, joining 2 of Assyria's oldest and most bitter enemies into a single coalition with one shared goal: to end the empire that had terrorized them for generations. In 612 BCE, that coalition converged on Nineveh, the magnificent Assyrian capital, home to Ashurbanipal's great library and some of the largest, most extravagant palaces the ancient world had ever built. After a brutal siege, the city fell, and it burned. Ancient accounts describe the destruction as near total. Ironically, the great library survived almost by accident. Its clay tablets, rather than being destroyed, were baked hard by the very fires that consumed the palace around them, preserving them for archaeologists thousands of years later. Assyrian remnants regrouped further west at the city of Haran, attempting one final stand. They even secured help from an old, unlikely source: Egypt, once a conquered enemy, now suddenly useful as an ally against a common threat. It wasn't enough. By 609 BCE, the last organized Assyrian resistance was crushed completely. An empire that had stood unbroken for nearly 300 years had ceased to exist within a single generation. And this is what makes Assyria's story different from the typical rise and fall arc you hear again and again in history. Most empires collapse slowly, worn down by economic decline, by internal corruption, by decades of gradual erosion. Assyria didn't decline. It collapsed almost overnight because it had spent 300 years making absolutely certain that when it finally stumbled, not a single soul would be willing to help it back up. The very strategy that built the empire, terror, deportation, public humiliation, is the exact same reason there was no ally left to call on when the coalition finally arrived at Nineveh's gates. Assyria didn't just lose a war, it ran out of anyone in the entire world willing to save it. Assyria proved that you can build the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever seen, conquer farther and faster than any empire before it, and still lose everything. Because power built entirely on fear has no foundation left standing the moment that fear finally stops working. If you want more stories of empires that rose fast and fell even faster, subscribe to Tales and Eras, because history has a lot more of these than you'd think.